The morning of March 17th, 1944, 26,000 feet above the industrial heartland of Germany, Oberleutnant Franz Stigler sat in the cockpit of his Messerschmitt Bf 109, scanning the sky with the practiced eye of a man who had survived 200 combat missions. Below him, a formation of American B-17 bombers crawled across the sky like a stream of silver beetles, their contrails writing temporary signatures in the frozen air. Above the bombers, where they always were now, circled the escorts, Republic P-47 Thunderbolts. Stigler counted them. 8, 12. No, more than that. They kept appearing, climbing out of the sun, positioned with the altitude advantage. His wingman's voice crackled over the radio in clipped German. Should we attack? Stigler watched the Thunderbolts for another moment, calculating angles, distances, fuel states. These weren't the uncertain American pilots of 1943. These were confident, well-trained hunters who understood their aircraft's strengths. 9, Stigler finally responded. Too many. Wrong altitude. We wait for better conditions. It was a calculation that Luftwaffe aces across Germany were making dozens of times each day. Not cowardice. Mathematics. The P-47 wasn't just another fighter anymore. It had become something far more dangerous, a weapon deployed in numbers that defied comprehension, flown by pilots who had learned to exploit every advantage of their heavy, powerful machines. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The German pilots called it the Swarm. By early 1944, it seemed impossible that there could be so many American fighters. Every bomber formation had escorts. Every fighter sweep involved dozens of Thunderbolts. Shot one down, and 5 more appeared the next day. The psychological impact was profound. Luftwaffe pilots who had once been the hunters were now being hunted by an enemy that never seemed to run out of aircraft, ammunition, or pilots. This is the story of how American industrial capacity transformed aerial warfare, how the mere existence of 15,686 P-47 Thunderbolts changed the calculations of Germany's most skilled pilots, and how quantity became a quality all its own. In January 1943, when the first P-47 Thunderbolts arrived in England, Luftwaffe intelligence officers prepared briefings for frontline fighter units. The assessment was almost dismissive. The American aircraft was enormous, weighing as much as 8 tons fully loaded. It was powered by a massive radial engine that made it look ungainly and crude. Its turning performance was predicted to be poor. Its climb rate was assessed as inadequate. The intelligence summary concluded that the P-47 represented typical American design philosophy: brute force over finesse, mass over 12er, elegance. German pilots, flying the nimble Focke-Wulf 190 and the legendary Messerschmitt Bf 109, were confident. They had been winning the air war over Europe for years. The British had thrown Spitfires at them. The Soviets had sent waves of Yaks and Lajis. The Germans had adapted, evolved, and continued to dominate. This new American fighter would be no different. The early combat reports seemed to confirm this assessment. In April and May of 1943, P-47 seconds were shot down in embarrassing numbers. German pilots reported that the American fighter was indeed clumsy at low altitude, poor in turning engagements, and flown by inexperienced pilots who made predictable mistakes. Laughter in Luftwaffe mess halls was genuine. The Americans had sent a flying milk bottle to fight the masters of aerial combat. But then something changed. By late summer of 1943, the combat reports started including disturbing details. P-47 seconds were no longer trying to turn fight with German aircraft. They were staying high, using their superior altitude performance to dictate engagement terms. They would dive from above, make a single devastating pass with their 850 caliber machine guns, then zoom climb back to safety before German fighters could react. More troubling, damaged P-47 seconds kept flying. German pilots reported hitting American fighters with cannon fire that should have been fatal, only to watch the Thunderbolts absorb the damage and limp home. The rugged, radial engine, the armor protection, the sheer size of the aircraft, all combined to create a fighter that refused to die. Hauptmann Heinz Beer, a Luftwaffe ace with over 200 victories, wrote in his diary about the changing tactical situation. The Americans were learning. Their pilots were gaining experience. Their tactics were evolving. And most concerning of all, there were more of them every single day. By January 1944, the situation had transformed completely. The 8th Air Force was launching massive daylight bombing raids deep into Germany, and every single formation was escorted by what seemed like limitless numbers of P-47 seconds. Luftwaffe fighter units found themselves outnumbered 3-1, sometimes 5-1. German aces who had once aggressively hunted enemy aircraft were now forced to pick their engagements carefully, waiting for moments when they might have numerical parity or tactical advantage. The legendary Adolf Galland, general of fighters for the Luftwaffe, received increasingly desperate reports from his unit commanders. They weren't asking for better tactics or improved training. They were asking for more aircraft. The attrition rate was becoming unsustainable. Major Gerhard Barkhorn, who would finish the war as the second highest scoring ace in history, with 301 victories, later recalled the psychological shift. In 1942 and early 1943, Luftwaffe pilots assumed air superiority. They launched from their bases, expecting to dominate any engagement. By mid-1944, they launched knowing they were outnumbered, knowing that American fighters would have the altitude advantage, knowing that even if they scored kills, more American aircraft would appear tomorrow. The numbers were staggering, and German intelligence was beginning to understand just how staggering they were. American factories were producing aircraft at rates that seemed impossible. The Willow Run plant in Michigan was building B-24 bombers. The Republic Aviation factory in Farmingdale, New York, was churning out P-47 Thunderbolts. At peak production in 1944, one P-47 rolled off the assembly line every single hour. Every hour, 24 aircraft per day, over 700 aircraft per month, just from one factory. German intelligence officers analyzing these numbers initially assumed they must be propaganda or exaggeration. No industrial system could sustain that level of production. But reconnaissance photographs of American airfields in England told a different story. The airfields were packed with P-47 seconds, row after row, squadron after squadron, group after group. And they kept arriving. Every week brought more ships across the Atlantic carrying more fighters, more pilots, more spare parts, more ammunition. The industrial capacity gap wasn't just large, it was existential. Oberstleutnant Johannes Steinhoff, commanding officer of Jagdgeschwader 77, faced this reality every morning during his briefings. His unit was assigned to defend against American daylight raids targeting ball-bearing factories and aircraft plants in southern Germany. The tactical problem was simple but unsolvable. His unit had perhaps 20 to 30 fighters operationally ready on any given morning. The American raids would include 200 to 300 bombers, escorted by 100 to 200 P-47 seconds, and eventually P-51 Mustangs, as, well. Even if every German pilot scored 2 kills, they would barely dent the formation before running out of ammunition or fuel. And tomorrow, the Americans would return with fresh aircraft replacing their losses. Steinhoff later wrote about the psychological burden this placed on his pilots. They weren't cowards. They attacked repeatedly, often with suicidal courage. But courage couldn't overcome mathematics. The calculations were brutal and inescapable. The Luftwaffe attempted various tactical adaptations. One approach was to use heavily armed and armoured Focke-Wulf 190s as bomber-destroyers, specifically designed to attack the B-17 formations while lighter. More agile Messerschmitts tried to occupy the P-47 escorts. This worked occasionally, when conditions were perfect and German fighters achieved surprise. But perfect conditions were rare. The P-47 seconds were almost always positioned with altitude advantage. Their pilots had learned to stay high, forcing German fighters to climb through disadvantageous altitudes where the Thunderbolt's turbo supercharger gave it superior performance. By the time German fighters reached combat altitude, they were often low on fuel and energy, while the P-47 seconds were fresh and positioned perfectly for diving attacks. Another attempted solution was concentration of force. Instead of spreading fighter units across multiple bases, the Luftwaffe tried to concentrate larger formations to achieve local numerical superiority. On paper, this made sense. In practice, it was difficult to coordinate. German fighters would assemble into large formations, but by the time they organized and climbed to altitude, the American bombers were often past their interception point, and the P-47 escorts, watching from above, would simply wait for the perfect moment to dive into the climbing German formations, disrupting them before they could attack the bombers. The Americans had time on their side. Their pilots had been briefed to be patient, to maintain altitude, to wait for German fighters to make mistakes. And the Germans, desperate to stop the bombing, were forced to make those mistakes. Major Günther Rahl, another high-scoring ace with 275 victories, described the strategic hopelessness of the situation. Every successful combat mission, even if they shot down American bombers and fighters, was ultimately a defeat because the losses were unsustainable. A German pilot shot down over his own territory might be killed. If he survived and was wounded, he might be out of action for months. His aircraft was almost certainly a total loss. Training his replacement took time and resources Germany no longer had. Meanwhile, an American pilot shot down over Germany became a prisoner of war. His aircraft was replaced within days from the endless production lines. His replacement pilot arrived with hundreds of hours of training. The loss ratio that would have been devastating to the Americans was merely inconvenient. The loss ratio that was inconvenient to Germany was fatal. The actual production numbers, when German intelligence finally compiled reliable estimates in mid-1944, were shocking enough that some Luftwaffe officers refused to believe them. The United States had produced over 9,000 P-47 Thunderbolts by June of 1944. Production was still accelerating. By war's end, the total would exceed 15,600 units. For context, Germany's total production of single-engine fighters across all types, Messerschmitts, Focke-Wulfs, and others, would reach approximately 36,000 units for the entire war. And German production was constantly disrupted by Allied bombing, material shortages, and the chaos of a collapsing war economy. American production faced no such disruptions. The factories were 3,000 miles from the nearest enemy bomber. Raw materials flowed freely. Skilled workers were available in abundance. The industrial system operated at peak efficiency, churning out not just fighters but everything else needed to support them: engines, propellers, instruments, radios, ammunition, spare parts. The logistics chain was so robust that American fighter units in England rarely faced shortages of any kind. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Luftwaffe aces began refusing engagements not out of cowardice but from tactical realism. Oberleutnant Walter Krupinski, an ace with 197 victories, was explicit about this in post-war interviews. Experienced pilots learned to evaluate each potential engagement based on multiple factors: altitude differential, numerical odds, fuel state, proximity to friendly bases, and critically, whether the tactical situation offered any reasonable chance of success. If the P-47 seconds had altitude advantage and numerical superiority, attacking was often suicide without purpose. Better to preserve aircraft and pilots for an engagement where conditions might be favorable. This was a profound psychological shift for pilots who had spent years as hunters, not prey. The mathematics of attrition warfare were merciless. Consider a typical scenario from spring of 1944. A Luftwaffe fighter unit with 20 operational aircraft intercepts an American bomber formation escorted by 60 P-47 seconds. The German pilots attack with courage and skill. They shoot down 3 bombers and 2 P-47 seconds before being forced to disengage due to fuel limitations. In the process, they lose 4 of their own aircraft and 2 pilots killed. On paper, this might seem like a favorable exchange ratio, but the strategic reality was different. The Americans would replace their 5 lost aircraft within a week. The replacement pilots would arrive with adequate training. The bomber formation would return tomorrow with a different set of aircraft and crews. Meanwhile, the German unit now had 16 operational aircraft instead of 20. The 4 lost aircraft would take weeks or months to replace, if they could be replaced at all. The 2 dead pilots were irreplaceable. Their experience, their combat knowledge, their skill, all gone forever. Repeat this scenario daily across hundreds of engagements, and the outcome was inevitable. The psychological impact on Luftwaffe pilots was documented in letters, diaries, and post-war memoirs. There's a recurring theme of exhaustion, not just physical, but existential. Pilots describe the feeling of fighting an endless, unstoppable tide. No matter how many kills they achieved, no matter how bravely they fought, the Americans just kept coming. Johannes Steinhoff wrote about watching his young pilots, fresh from training schools that had been forced to cut instruction time due to fuel shortages, flying into combat with barely enough skills to take off and land safely. They faced American pilots who had received hundreds of hours of training, who flew aircraft that were forgiving and robust, who had confidence born from numerical superiority. The outcome was predictable and tragic. The operational readiness rates tell their own story. By mid-1944, an American P-47 squadron with 50 aircraft might have 40 to 45 available for operations on any given day. The remainder would be undergoing routine maintenance or minor repairs. A German fighter squadron with 50 aircraft on paper might have 25 to 30 actually flyable. The others were waiting for spare parts that weren't available, or undergoing repairs that couldn't be completed due to material shortages, or simply grounded due to lack of fuel for training flights that would keep pilots proficient. The multiplication was devastating. American numerical advantage on paper was doubled or tripled by operational readiness advantages in practice. The famous Luftwaffe aces, the Profileute, pilots with over 100 victories, whose names were celebrated in German propaganda, were dying, not all at once, but steadily, inexorably. Egon Meyer, 51 victories, killed in March 1944. Anton Hafner, 204 victories, killed in October 1944. Gerhard Barkhorn survived the war but was shot down 9 times. Walter Krupinski survived but was shot down 4 times and wounded multiple times. The survivorship bias was extreme. For every famous ace who survived, dozens of average pilots were killed. The Luftwaffe fighter force was being bled white, not through incompetence or cowardice, but through simple mathematics. Adolf Galland, watching this unfold from his position as General of Fighters, made increasingly desperate attempts to address the crisis. He pushed for production increases, which were promised but never materialized at needed scale. He advocated for the May 262 jet fighter, which offered performance advantages but came too late and in too few numbers. He argued for concentrating remaining fighters in mass formations for decisive battles rather than spreading them thin across all fronts. Some of these initiatives had limited success, but none could address the fundamental problem. Germany's industrial capacity was a fraction of America's, and that fraction was shrinking as Allied bombing intensified. The breaking point came during Big Week in February 1944, when the 8th Air Force launched massive raids specifically targeting German aircraft production facilities. The Luftwaffe threw everything available into the defense, achieving local successes but suffering catastrophic losses. Over 300 German fighters were destroyed in 1 week of intensive combat. The Americans lost heavy bombers and escort fighters as well, but their losses were replaced within days. The German losses, particularly inexperienced pilots, were irreplaceable. After Big Week, the character of the air war changed fundamentally. The Luftwaffe went from being an offensive force to being a defensive force, struggling for survival. By summer of 1944, following D-Day, the situation deteriorated further. P-47 seconds weren't just escorting bombers anymore. They were conducting fighter sweeps, actively hunting for Luftwaffe fighters. They were attacking German airfields on the ground, destroying aircraft before they could even take off. They were performing ground attack missions with bombs and rockets, destroying the railway network that moved supplies to the front. The Thunderbolt's versatility, another consequence of its robust design and powerful engine, meant it could fulfill multiple roles that required different specialized aircraft in German service. Experienced Luftwaffe pilots developed elaborate survival strategies. They learned to avoid engagement unless multiple factors favored them: altitude advantage, numerical advantage, surprise, and proximity to friendly bases for rapid landing if damaged. They learned to exploit weather, using clouds for concealment. They learned to attack during moments when American escort fighters were low on fuel and forced to return to base. But these cautious tactics, while keeping experienced pilots alive longer, meant the bombers were getting through. The strategic mission of destroying German industry and infrastructure was succeeding. The final months of the war saw the complete collapse of the Luftwaffe as an effective fighting force. By early 1945, fuel shortages were so severe that many operational aircraft sat grounded simply because there was no gasoline to fly them. Pilot training had been reduced to the point where new pilots sometimes had fewer than 30 hours of total flight time before entering combat. Meanwhile, the Americans were fielding not just P-47 seconds, but also the longer-ranged P-51 Mustang, creating a two-tier escort system where P-47 seconds handled near-range protection and P-51 seconds escorted deep into Germany. The Luftwaffe's fighter force, once the terror of European skies, was reduced to sporadic, desperate attacks that rarely achieved meaningful results. The production statistics from war's end tell the complete story. The United States produced 15,686 P-47 Thunderbolts. Production peaked at over 700 units per month. At one point, Republic Aviation's factory was completing one Thunderbolt every 43 minutes around the clock. The supply chain supporting this production included over 125,000 Pratt & Whitney R-2800 engines, manufactured not just by Pratt & Whitney, but by Ford, Chevrolet, and other automotive giants converted to war production. Tens of thousands of workers, many of them women replacing men who had joined the military, worked in shifts around the clock. The industrial mobilization was total and overwhelming. Germany, by contrast, produced approximately 36,000 single-engine fighters of all types during the entire war. This sounds substantial until you realize it was split among multiple aircraft types, that production was constantly disrupted, and that operational readiness rates meant only a fraction were ever simultaneously combat-ready. At the peak of American numerical advantage in early 1945, there might be over 1,000 American fighters operational in the European theater on any given day, facing fewer than 300 operational German fighters defending all of Germany and occupied territories combined. The story of Luftwaffe aces refusing to engage P-47 seconds is ultimately not a story about cowardice or incompetence. It's a story about professional soldiers making rational decisions in an impossible situation. Experienced German pilots understood mathematics. They understood that trading their lives and irreplaceable aircraft for marginally favorable combat results served no strategic purpose when the enemy could replace losses faster than they could be inflicted. The refusal to engage was an acknowledgement of strategic defeat, even while individual pilots continued to fight with skill and courage when circumstances permitted. Post-war interviews with surviving Luftwaffe aces reveal a consistent theme. They respect their opponents. They acknowledge that American pilots, especially by late 1943 and throughout 1944, were well-trained and competent. They admit that American aircraft, particularly the P-47 and P-51, were excellent designs. But more than anything, they emphasize the sheer, overwhelming, inconceivable scale of American production. Werner Mulders, before his death in 1941, supposedly said that Germany would lose the war, not because German pilots weren't brave enough, but because Germany couldn't build aircraft fast enough. By 1944, his prophecy had been proven absolutely correct. The P-47 Thunderbolt's legacy isn't just about its technical capabilities. It's about what 15,686 of them represented. Each aircraft required thousands of man-hours to produce. Each pilot required hundreds of hours of training. Each mission required fuel, ammunition, spare parts, maintenance, and support infrastructure. The totality of this system, replicated thousands of times across an industrial base 3,000 miles from the battlefield, represented a form of power that tactical excellence couldn't counter. Quality matters in war, but quantity has a quality all its own. The Luftwaffe aces learned this lesson the hardest way possible, watching their air force ground down by an enemy that simply could not be stopped through conventional means. The final irony is that the P-47 was never Germany's most capable opponent in pure performance terms. The British Spitfire could outturn it. The P-51 Mustang had better range. Soviet fighters were more numerous on the Eastern Front. But the P-47 represented something more threatening than performance. It represented the industrial capacity to build 15,686 of them, to put them all into combat simultaneously, to replace every loss, to train every pilot, to sustain operations indefinitely. German aces didn't refuse to engage P-47 seconds because they feared the aircraft. They refused because they understood that behind every P-47 they saw were 10 more they didn't see, and behind those were factories producing more every single hour. That realization, more than any individual combat, marked the psychological end of the Luftwaffe's air superiority. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe. The surrender came on May 8, 1945. Across Germany, Luftwaffe fighter bases fell silent. Rows of aircraft, many of them the latest models that had arrived too late and in too few numbers, sat, abandoned on cratered runways. In England and across newly liberated Europe, American fighter bases were still packed with P-47 Thunderbolts. Thousands of them, more than would ever be needed now that the war in Europe had ended. But the war wasn't over. Half a world away, in the Pacific theatre, another struggle was reaching its climax, and the lessons learned in European skies, lessons written in the blood of Luftwaffe pilots who had faced overwhelming American production, were about to be applied against another enemy who had also underestimated American industrial capacity. The Pacific War had always been different from the European conflict. The distances were vast, measured in thousands of miles of open ocean. The enemy, Imperial Japan, had begun the war with exceptional pilots flying highly maneuverable aircraft like the Mitsubishi A6M0. But by 1945, Japan faced the same mathematics that had destroyed the Luftwaffe. Their best pilots were dead. Their aircraft production was crippled. Their fuel supplies were nearly exhausted. And the Americans were coming with numbers that defied comprehension. P-47 Thunderbolts had been fighting in the Pacific since 1943, though in smaller numbers than in Europe. The earlier models had struggled with the extreme ranges required for Pacific operations. But by 1944 and 45, improved variants with additional fuel capacity and better tropical cooling systems were arriving in significant numbers. The 5th and 7th Air Forces deployed hundreds of Thunderbolts to bases in the Philippines, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. The missions were different from Europe: more ground attack, more support for island invasions, less high-altitude bomber escort, but the underlying principle remained the same: overwhelming force applied relentlessly. Japanese pilots, like their German counterparts before them, initially dismissed the P-47 as crude and ungainly. Japanese fighters prided themselves on maneuverability and lightness. The Zero could outturn anything in the sky. Japanese doctrine emphasized agility and pilot skill. The P-47, predictably, couldn't compete in a turning dogfight. But also predictably, American pilots had learned not to dogfight. They used the same boom and zoom tactics that had worked in Europe, diving from altitude, making a single devastating pass, then using speed and power to escape before Japanese fighters could respond. The real killer in the Pacific wasn't air-to-air combat, though. It was ground attack. P-47 seconds ranged across Japanese-held islands and mainland Asia, destroying everything that moved. They attacked airfields, catching Japanese aircraft on the ground where they were helpless. They strafed shipping, sinking transport vessels that Japan desperately needed to move supplies. They bombed railway bridges and supply depots. They provided close air support for American troops fighting their way across the Pacific. The term, Japanese called them the Black Death because of their dark paint schemes and the destruction they brought. By summer of 1945, Japan's situation was hopeless. American bombers were burning Japanese cities with impunity. The naval blockade had strangled imports of oil and raw materials. And overhead, constantly, were American fighters, including hundreds of P-47 seconds, that the Japanese Air Force was powerless to stop. When the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August, they ended a war that American industrial production had already won. The P-47 had been one tool among many, but it represented the same principle that had defeated Germany, the capacity to produce weapons in numbers that no amount of courage or skill could overcome. The end of World War II left the United States with an enormous surplus of military equipment. There were P-47 Thunderbolts everywhere on airfields across America, in storage depots, still on factory production lines when contracts were suddenly cancelled. The total production had reached 15,686 aircraft. Now most of them were unnecessary. The military began a massive demobilization. Thousands of P-47 seconds were scrapped, melted down for their aluminum and steel. Others were sold to foreign governments at bargain prices. Some remained in service with the newly independent United States Air Force, which had separated from the Army in 1947. But the P-47's story didn't end with World War II. The aircraft found a second life in conflicts around the world during the late 1940s and 1950s. The National Guard and Air Force Reserve operated Thunderbolts until the early 1950s, using them for training and air defense. More significantly, P-47 seconds were exported to allies who needed capable fighter bombers, but couldn't afford or didn't need the latest jet technology. The French Air Force received P-47 seconds and used them extensively in the First Indochina War, flying ground attack missions against Viet Minh forces. The aircraft's ruggedness and heavy armament made it ideal for the challenging conditions of jungle warfare. Brazilian Air Force P-47 seconds flew combat missions during World War II and continued in service for years afterward. The Chinese Nationalist Air Force used Thunderbolts during the Chinese Civil War. The Turkish, Iranian, and numerous Latin American air forces operated P-47 seconds well into the 1950s. Perhaps most notably, the Yugoslavian Air Force operated P-47 seconds after the war, and in 1952, Yugoslav Thunderbolts shot down 2 American C-47 transport aircraft that had strayed into Yugoslav airspace. It was a strange twist, American-built fighters shooting down American-built transports, demonstrating how thoroughly Cold War politics had reshuffled alliances and equipment. The last combat use of P-47 seconds came in 1955, when the Bolivian Air Force used them during internal conflicts. By that point, the Thunderbolt was thoroughly obsolete by modern standards. Jets had taken over frontline service everywhere. But the fact that P-47 seconds remained operational and combat effective 10 years after the war ended testified to the robustness of the design. These weren't museum pieces being flown out of nostalgia. They were practical weapons, still capable of fulfilling their mission. The lessons of the P-47's success were not lost on military planners. The aircraft had proven that in modern warfare, survivability and operational reliability could be more valuable than peak performance. It had demonstrated that ground attack aircraft needed to be tough enough to absorb punishment from anti-aircraft fire. It had shown that overwhelming firepower could compensate for lack of agility, and it had established that industrial production capacity could be a decisive strategic weapon. These lessons influenced American military aviation for decades. During the Korean War, the Air Force found itself needing close air support aircraft for ground forces. Jets like the F-80 and F-84 could fly ground attack missions, but they were fast, delicate, and expensive. The older propeller-driven aircraft proved more suitable for the messy work of close air support. The A-1 Skyraider, which entered service in 1946, embodied many P-47 principles: heavily armed, armoured, able to carry enormous ordnance loads, and tough enough to survive ground fire. Skyraiders served through Vietnam, proving the continued relevance of the design philosophy. But the true spiritual successor to the P-47 wouldn't appear until the 1970s. The United States Air Force issued a requirement for a specialized close air support aircraft. The specifications could have been written by someone studying the P-47's combat record. Heavy armament, extreme survivability, ability to operate from forward bases, and the capacity to loiter over battlefields, providing sustained support to ground troops. The result was the Fairchild Republic, a 10 Thunderbolt II, nicknamed the Warthog. The lineage was explicit. Fairchild Republic was the descendant of Republic Aviation, the company that had built the original Thunderbolt. The name was a deliberate tribute, and the design philosophy was nearly identical, updated for jet-age technology. The A-10 was built around its gun, a massive 30mm rotary cannon, just as the P-47 had been built around its .850 caliber machine guns. The A-10 featured redundant systems, armored cockpit, separated engines to improve survivability, all echoes of P-47 design principles. It was slow by jet standards, ungainly, and optimized for a single mission rather than being a multi-role compromise. When the A-10 entered service in 1977, critics made predictable complaints. It was too specialized, too slow, too ugly, too focused on a single mission. The criticisms echoed those made about the P-47 35 years earlier. And like the P-47, the A-10 proved its worth in combat. During the Gulf War in 1991, A-10 seconds destroyed thousands of Iraqi vehicles, tanks, and artillery pieces. They absorbed battle damage that would have destroyed other aircraft and kept flying. They provided close air support that ground troops considered invaluable. The Warthog, like its ancestor, became beloved by those who depended on it and respected by those who faced it. The parallel between P-47 and A-10 extends to their survival in military service. Both aircraft faced repeated attempts to retire them in favor of supposedly superior alternatives. The P-47 was nearly obsoleted by the P-51 Mustang during World War II, but found its niche in ground attack. The A-10 has faced retirement efforts since the 1991 Gulf War, with Air Force leadership repeatedly trying to eliminate it in favor of multi-role fighters like the F-16 and F-35. But ground troops and close air support advocates have fought to keep the A-10 in service, arguing that no other aircraft can fulfill its mission as effectively. As of this writing, A-10 seconds remain operational, still flying the same mission profile their ancestor flew 70 years ago. The deeper legacy of the P-47 lies in what it represented strategically. World War II marked a turning point in military history where industrial capacity became as important as tactical innovation. Previous wars had been decided primarily by strategy, leadership, and the courage of individual soldiers. World War II added a new dimension: the ability to produce weapons, ammunition, fuel, and supplies in quantities that overwhelmed opponents regardless of their tactical skill. Germany and Japan both entered World War II with the assumption that superior training, better tactics, and technological edge would compensate for smaller industrial bases. Both were wrong. The Luftwaffe's aces were genuinely more skilled than most Allied pilots, especially in the post-Soviet early war years. German aircraft were often technically superior in specific performance metrics. Japanese pilots in 1941 and 42 were among the best in the world. None of it mattered. America's capacity to build 15,686 P-47 seconds, plus 13,000 P-51 seconds, plus 12,000 P-38 seconds, plus all the bombers, all the ships, all the tanks, all the ammunition, this industrial tsunami was unstoppable. The Soviet Union applied the same principle on the Eastern Front. Soviet aircraft were generally inferior to German designs in performance. Soviet pilots were less extensively trained, but the Soviet Union produced over 36,000 Yak fighters, over 16,000 La-5, 7 fighters, over 33,000 Il-2 ground attack aircraft. The Red Army buried the Wehrmacht under sheer mass of equipment. The parallel was exact, industrial capacity translating directly into military power. Post-war military theory incorporated these lessons. NATO's strategy during the Cold War explicitly acknowledged that the Soviet Union had numerical advantages in tanks, artillery, and troops. The counter-strategy relied partly on technological superiority, but primarily on the assumption that American and Allied industrial capacity could sustain a long war of attrition. The Soviet Union's collapse in 1991 came partly from military overextension but primarily from economic exhaustion, unable to match Western industrial output. The P-47's lesson that wars are won by the side that can keep fighting longest remained valid. Modern warfare has shifted the equation somewhat. Precision weapons and information technology have changed combat calculations. A single modern fighter with precision-guided munitions can accomplish missions that would have required hundreds of World War II aircraft. But the underlying principle hasn't changed. America's military dominance in recent decades has rested as much on logistics and industrial sustainment as on technology. The ability to deploy forces globally, supply them indefinitely, and replace losses quickly remains a decisive advantage. There's a counter-lesson here too, one that American military planners sometimes forget. The P-47s succeeded not just because 15,000 of them were built, but because they were the right aircraft for their mission. Overemphasis on technological sophistication and multi-role versatility can create weapons that are too expensive, too complex, and, ironically, less effective than simpler alternatives. The F-35 Lightning II program, with its trillion-dollar development cost and ongoing technical problems, represents the opposite philosophy from the P-47. Extreme complexity, maximum versatility, and costs that limit procurement numbers. Some military historians argue that the United States would be better served by having more numerous, simpler, more specialized aircraft rather than fewer exquisitely capable but complex multi-role platforms. It's the P-47 versus P-51 debate in modern form. Do you want a specialized workhorse or a more versatile thoroughbred? The answer, probably, is that you need both. The P-47 and P-51 complemented each other in World War II, each excelling in its specialized role. The human story of the P-47 shouldn't be forgotten either. Over 15,000 aircraft meant over 15,000 pilots who flew them in combat, plus countless ground crew who maintained them. These weren't faceless components of industrial statistics. They were individuals, some became aces, most were ordinary pilots doing an extraordinarily dangerous job. Robert S. Johnson, who survived being shot up so badly by a German fighter that he couldn't bail out and somehow flew his wreck home, finished the war with 28 confirmed kills. Francis Gaby Gabreski, the top P-47 ace with 28 victories in Europe, survived being shot down and spending time as a prisoner of war, then flew jets in Korea and survived that too. Neil Kirby won the Medal of Honor for a mission where his P-47 destroyed 6 Japanese aircraft in a single engagement. He was killed in combat 4 months later. For every famous ace, there were dozens of pilots who flew their tours, fought their fights, and went home to build lives after the war. There were pilots who were shot down and captured, spending years in POW camps. There were pilots who died in training accidents before ever seeing combat, a reminder that just because the P-47 was safer than many aircraft didn't mean it was safe. Flying high-performance fighters was inherently dangerous, even without enemy action. And there were ground crew who worked 18-hour days in all weather conditions to keep aircraft flying, mechanics whose names never made the newspapers but whose skill kept pilots alive. The production workers deserve mention too. Building 15,686 aircraft required millions of man-hours of labor. At peak production, Republic Aviation's Farmingdale factory employed over 20,000 workers. Many were women, joining the workforce in unprecedented numbers to replace men who had joined the military. Rosie the Riveter wasn't just a propaganda figure, she was real, multiplied thousands of times across American factories. These workers built aircraft that they would never fly, that would be shipped to distant battlefields they would never see, to fight in a war whose strategic details they might barely understand. But they understood that their work mattered, that every aircraft completed meant American pilots had a better chance of coming home. The economic impact of P-47 production was substantial. Republic Aviation became one of Long Island's largest employers. Pratt & Whitney, building the R-2000, 800 engines, expanded massively. Subcontractors producing everything from instruments to propellers to ammunition created a vast industrial network. The skills and technologies developed during wartime production translated into post-war economic growth. Companies that had learned mass production techniques for military equipment applied those lessons to civilian manufacturing. Workers who had gained technical skills in aircraft factories became the skilled workforce of the post-war boom. There's one final story worth telling, a coda that brings us back to where we started. In the 1980s, a German historian interviewed surviving Luftwaffe veterans for an oral history project. One of the interview subjects was a former fighter pilot who had flown Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs over Germany during the final years of the war. The interviewer asked him what he remembered most clearly about the air combat. The veteran thought for a long moment before answering. "The numbers," he finally said. "I remember the numbers. We would scramble to intercept a bomber formation, and as we climbed, we would count the escorts. 40 P-47 seconds, 60 P-47 seconds, sometimes 100. And we would have 12 aircraft, maybe 15 if we were lucky. We would attack anyway because that was our duty, but we all knew. The mathematics were impossible. We couldn't kill them faster than they could be replaced." The interviewer pressed him, "What about pilot skill, tactical innovation, better aircraft?" The veteran shook his head. All of that mattered, yes, but not enough. They had more pilots, more aircraft, more fuel, more ammunition, more of everything. They learned from their mistakes because they could afford to make mistakes. We couldn't. One mistake and you were dead, and your replacement was a boy with 30 hours of training flying an aircraft held together with hope. By 1944, we weren't fighting American pilots. We were fighting American factories, and you cannot shoot down a factory. That veteran's words capture the essential truth of the P-47's role in World War II. It wasn't the most elegant fighter. It wasn't the fastest or most maneuverable. It wasn't the most technologically advanced, but there were 15,686 of them, and behind each one was an industrial system capable of building another one tomorrow. That capacity, that relentless, overwhelming, unstoppable production, represented a form of power that no amount of tactical brilliance could defeat. The story of the P-47 Thunderbolt is ultimately a story about the nature of modern war. Individual excellence matters, technology matters, strategy and tactics matter, but in total war, the side with greater resources, more efficiently organized and more ruthlessly applied, will grind down any opponent, regardless of their courage or skill. The Luftwaffe's aces learned this lesson in the skies over Germany as they watched the milk bottle they had once mocked blot out the sun in formations so large they could barely be counted. And the lesson remained valid long after the last P-47 flew its last combat mission. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt flew into history as an underdog, matured into a warrior, and emerged as a legend. But its deepest legacy isn't about the aircraft itself. It's about what 15,686 of them meant, a demonstration that in the calculus of war, quantity multiplied by quality equals dominance, and that the nation capable of sustaining both will prevail over enemies who possess only one or the other. The Luftwaffe's aces refused to engage P-47 seconds, not because they had lost their courage, but because they had gained a terrible wisdom. They were fighting not an enemy, but an inevitability, and inevitabilities cannot be defeated, only endured until they run their course. That course ran from 1943 to 1945, written in contrails across European and Pacific skies, measured in thousands of missions and millions of rounds of ammunition, and ending in the silence of abandoned German airfields and the thunder of American aircraft overhead. The joke had become a juggernaut, and the laughter had died in the realization of what those numbers truly represented. The immediate aftermath of victory in Europe revealed the true scale of what had been accomplished. Allied intelligence teams fanned out across Germany, documenting what remained of the Luftwaffe. What they found was sobering. In hidden forests and camouflaged dispersal fields, they discovered hundreds of German aircraft that had never flown combat missions. Messerschmitt Bf 109s, fresh from factories, sat with empty fuel tanks. Advanced jet fighters like the Me-262, potentially capable of challenging Allied air superiority, were parked uselessly because there was no fuel to fly them and no experienced pilots to fly them, even if fuel existed. The contrast was stark. At British and American airfields across liberated Europe, thousands of P-47 Thunderbolts sat ready for missions that would never come. Fuel trucks moved, constantly, keeping tanks topped off. Maintenance crews worked on routine inspections, replacing parts from well-stocked supply depots. Pilots, many of them with hundreds of combat hours, attended briefings for operations that were cancelled as Germany's collapse accelerated. The difference wasn't just in numbers of aircraft. It was in the entire operational ecosystem that supported those aircraft. Lieutenant Colonel Hub Zemke, who had commanded the 56th Fighter Group through much of the war, walked through a captured German airfield in May 1945. His group had been one of the first to receive P-47 seconds back in early 1943, and he had been instrumental in developing the tactics that made the Thunderbolt so effective. Now, examining abandoned Focke-Wulf 190s, he was struck by the quality of the German aircraft. These were well-designed, capable fighters, but they sat silent and useless while American aircraft continued operating at peak efficiency. Zemke later wrote about this experience. The Germans hadn't lost because their aircraft were inferior, he observed. They had lost because they couldn't keep their aircraft flying. Every system that supported combat operations, fuel production, spare parts, manufacturing, pilot training, maintenance infrastructure had been systematically destroyed by Allied bombing and strangled by resource shortages. The P-47 and other American aircraft had been instruments of this destruction, but they had also been beneficiaries of the opposite situation. American industry had operated without disruption, 3,000 miles from the nearest enemy bomber, producing everything needed to sustain air operations indefinitely. The export of P-47 seconds to Allied nations in the post-war years created interesting situations that illustrated how warfare had changed. Countries receiving American military aid got not just aircraft but entire packages of support, maintenance manuals, spare parts, training, programs, and technical advisors. This was the same systematic approach that had made American air power so effective during the war. It wasn't enough to have aircraft. You needed the complete infrastructure to operate them. The Peruvian Air Force provides a case study. Peru received several dozen P-47 seconds in the late 1940s as part of American military assistance programs. Peruvian pilots trained on the aircraft and found them relatively easy to fly compared to older fighters in their inventory. The maintenance requirements, while substantial, were manageable because detailed documentation existed and spare parts remained available from American stocks. When Ecuador and Peru engaged in a brief border conflict in 1941, before receiving P-47 seconds, both sides had struggled with aircraft availability. By the time tensions rose again in the early 1950s, Peru had Thunderbolts that were consistently operational. The conflict was resolved diplomatically, but the readiness differential made an impression on regional military planners. Similar patterns played out globally. Countries operating P-47 seconds found that American aircraft came with an implicit support structure that made sustained operations feasible. This was different from operating British or Soviet aircraft, which often came with minimal documentation and uncertain spare parts supplies. The lesson was clear. American military exports included not just hardware but systems, and systems worked better than hardware alone. The French experience in Indochina deserves deeper examination. The French Air Force operated several squadrons of P-47 seconds during the First Indochina War, from 1946 to 1954. The missions were primarily ground attack strafing Viet Minh positions, providing close air support for French troops, attacking supply lines through jungle terrain. The P-47's ruggedness proved essential. Aircraft returned from missions with battle damage from ground fire that would have downed lighter fighters. The heavy armament was effective against fortified positions. The long loiter time allowed pilots to provide sustained support during ground engagements. French pilots noted that the P-47 was forgiving enough that pilots with limited experience could fly combat missions safely. This was crucial because France was rebuilding its military after World War II and didn't have unlimited numbers of highly trained pilots available. The same design philosophy that had allowed America to rapidly expand its pilot force during the war, building aircraft that were safe and intuitive, now benefited France in a different conflict. But the French also discovered the limitations of operating American equipment in a different strategic context. The United States had maintained unlimited fuel supplies during World War II. France in Indochina faced fuel constraints that limited sortie rates. American wartime logistics had ensured constant supplies of ammunition and spare parts. French logistics in Indochina were strained, with parts sometimes taking months to arrive from France or America. The P-47 was designed for one kind of war: industrial, total war, with unlimited resources. Operating it in a limited war with constrained resources revealed assumptions built into the design. The Gulf War in 1991 provided a nearly perfect validation of the design philosophy that had created both the P-47 and A-10. Iraq had the fourth largest army in the world, with thousands of tanks, armored vehicles, and artillery pieces. Iraqi air defenses were extensive, with multiple layers of anti-aircraft guns and surface-to-air missiles. On paper, the Iraqi military looked formidable. In practice, they faced the same problem the Luftwaffe had faced 50 years earlier. They were fighting an opponent with overwhelming air power backed by unlimited industrial capacity. A-10 Warthogs flew thousands of sorties during the Gulf War. They operated in some of the most dangerous airspace, flying low and slow to identify and destroy ground targets. Iraqi anti-aircraft fire hit many A-10 seconds. Dozens returned to base with significant battle damage: holes in wings, damaged engines, shot-up hydraulic systems. The pilots would land safely, maintenance crews would work through the night repairing damage, and the aircraft would fly again the next day. This was the P-47 story, replayed with modern technology. The aircraft was designed to absorb punishment and keep flying, and it performed exactly as intended. One famous incident involved Captain Paul Johnson, whose A-10 was hit by an Iraqi surface-to-air missile. The missile destroyed one engine and severely damaged the aircraft's hydraulics and flight controls. Johnson fought to control the crippled aircraft, eventually managing to fly it back to base despite damage that should have been catastrophic. After landing, investigators counted over 150 holes in the aircraft from the missile and subsequent ground fire. The A-10 was repaired and flying combat missions again within a week. This incident echoed Major Robert Johnson's experience in World War II, flying a shot-up P-47 back to England, despite catastrophic damage. The parallel wasn't coincidental. Both aircraft were designed with survivability as a primary requirement, using redundant systems, armored protection, and robust construction to ensure that battle damage wouldn't necessarily mean loss of aircraft and pilot. This philosophy cost weight and complexity, reducing theoretical performance, but in actual combat conditions it proved invaluable. The Gulf War also demonstrated the continued relevance of the overwhelming numbers principle. The United States deployed over 1,000 combat aircraft to the theater, including nearly 300 A-10 seconds. Iraqi pilots quickly learned, just as Luftwaffe pilots had learned decades earlier, that engaging this force was suicidal. Iraqi aircraft that managed to take off were almost immediately shot down by American fighters with beyond visual range missiles and advanced radar. Most Iraqi aircraft never even attempted to fly, sitting in hardened shelters or being hidden in residential areas. By the second week of the war, the Iraqi Air Force had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. The parallels to 1944 and 1945 were remarkable. An outmatched air force, facing an opponent with superior numbers and industrial backing, was systematically destroyed, not through individual combat, but through overwhelming, sustained operations. Iraqi ground forces, like German ground forces 50 years before, were paralyzed by air power. Moving during daylight invited immediate attack. Supply lines were interrupted. Command and control was disrupted. When the ground war finally began, Iraqi forces had been so degraded by air attack that the ground campaign lasted barely 100 hours. The JETA, technological evolution from P-47 to modern aircraft, reveals both continuity and change in design philosophy. The P-47's Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine produced approximately 2,000 horsepower from 18 cylinders arranged in 2 radial rows. Modern military turbofan engines produce 40,000 pounds of thrust or more, equivalent to roughly 50,000 horsepower. The raw power increase is enormous, but certain principles remain constant. Modern engines, like the R2800, are designed for reliability under combat conditions. They must operate in extreme temperatures, at various altitudes, while sustaining battle damage. The F-16 fighter, powered by a single Pratt & Whitney or General Electric turbofan engine, was specifically designed to be maintainable by crew chiefs with moderate training using limited tools. This echoes the P-47's design philosophy: create systems that can be maintained under field conditions by personnel who may not be experts. The F-15 Eagle provides another example. When the Air Force issued requirements for what became the F-15, one specification was that the aircraft must be capable of flying home on one engine after sustaining battle damage. The twin-engine configuration, with engines widely spaced in the airframe, was specifically chosen to improve survivability. An enemy missile or cannon shell that destroyed one engine wouldn't necessarily damage the other. This was the same principle that made the P-47's radial engine superior to inline liquid-cooled engines. Redundancy and separation of critical systems improved combat survivability. Avionics and weapons systems have become exponentially more complex, but the human factors considerations that shaped the P-47's cockpit remain relevant. Modern fighters use multifunction displays and hands-on throttle and stick (HOTAS) controls that allow pilots to manage complex systems without excessive head-down time in the cockpit. The principle is identical to the P-47's. Color-coded instruments make the human-machine interface as intuitive as possible so pilots can focus on tactics rather than systems management. The industrial base supporting modern American military aviation is vastly more complex than World War II production, but certain patterns persist. Boeing, Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, and other major defense contractors maintain production lines capable of sustained output over years or decades. The F-16 production run exceeded 4,700 aircraft over 40 years. The F/A-18 Super Hornet has been in continuous production since 1995. These aren't P-47 numbers 15,000 in less than 4 years, but they represent the same principle of sustained production capability. More significantly, the supply chain supporting modern aircraft production is global and highly resilient. Components come from hundreds of subcontractors. Manufacturing techniques are documented and standardized. Quality control is rigorous. This is industrial mass production refined to unprecedented levels of sophistication. A World War II-era worker would recognize the fundamental approach, even if the specific technologies were incomprehensible. The question that military planners grapple with is whether this system remains viable for future conflicts. The P-47 cost approximately $83,000 in 1944, equivalent to roughly $1.2 million in current dollars. An F-35 Lightning II costs approximately $80 million per aircraft in current production. The price increase reflects vastly greater capability, but it also means that losing modern aircraft carries financial costs that World War II planners never faced. The United States cannot afford to lose F-35 seconds at the rate P-47 seconds were lost during intensive combat operations. This creates a strategic tension. Modern aircraft are far more capable individually, but losing one represents a much larger investment loss. During World War II, losing a P-47 was regrettable but acceptable because replacements were being produced faster than losses occurred. Losing an F-35 is strategically significant because production rates are much lower and the investment per aircraft is so much higher. The calculus of attrition warfare has shifted. Some analysts argue this means the United States should produce larger numbers of less expensive, less capable aircraft. Others argue that modern precision weapons and stealth technology have changed warfare so fundamentally that small numbers of highly capable platforms can accomplish missions that would have required hundreds of older aircraft. Both arguments have merit. The truth probably lies somewhere between. requiring a mix of high capability and high quantity systems. The P-47 represented an era when high quantity was achievable because individual aircraft were relatively simple and cheap. 15,686 aircraft were produced in about 3 years. That production rate is probably impossible to match with modern fighters regardless of funding, simply because modern aircraft are too complex. An F-35 contains millions of lines of software code. Its manufacturing requires specialized materials, precision machinery, and highly trained workers. You cannot train someone to build F-35 components in weeks or months the way Rosie the Riveter learned to build P-47 components in 1942. This reality has implications for future conflicts. If the United States enters a major war with a peer adversary like China, the conflict might last years. Can American industry ramp up production of modern fighters, ships, and missiles the way World War II industry ramped up P-47 production? Or has military technology become so sophisticated that rapid expansion is impossible? These questions don't have clear answers, but they're questions that the P-47 story makes unavoidable. One additional story captures the P-47's legacy in a personal way. In 2010, the Collings Foundation restored a P-47D Thunderbolt to flying condition. The aircraft, painted in the markings of the 63rd Fighter Squadron, appears at airshows across America, giving modern audiences a chance to see and hear what World War II veterans experienced. Watching the aircraft fly, you're immediately struck by the sound. The R2800 engine doesn't scream like a jet, it roars, a deep, powerful sound that you feel in your chest as much as hear with your ears. Airshow spectators, many born decades after World War II ended, often approach the aircraft with curiosity. The P-47 sits on the ramp, massive and purposeful. Children climb up to look in the cockpit, marveling at instruments that seem primitive compared to modern glass cockpits, but which were state-of-the-art in 1943. Veterans, now in their 90s, sometimes attend these airshows. Their reactions vary. Some want to touch the aircraft, reconnecting, with machines they flew or maintained 75 years ago. Others stand at a distance, lost in memories of friends who didn't come home. One veteran, interviewed at an airshow in 2015, had been a P-47 pilot with the 78th Fighter Group. He stood watching the restored Thunderbolt taxi out for a demonstration flight, and his eyes filled with tears. The interviewer asked what he was feeling. "I'm grateful," the veteran said quietly. "Grateful that people still remember. Grateful that they care enough to restore these aircraft and keep them flying. And I'm remembering the boys who didn't make it home. Every time I see a P-47, I remember them." That's perhaps the truest legacy of the 15,686 P-47 Thunderbolts built during World War II. They weren't just industrial products or weapons systems. They were the aircraft that brought thousands of young men home safely, protected bomber crews, supported ground troops, that helped end the most destructive war in human history. The strategic lessons about industrial capacity and sustained operations are important, but ultimately, the P-47's story is about people, the engineers who designed it, the workers who built it, the pilots who flew it, the mechanics who maintained it, and the enemies who learned to fear it. Modern military aviation has moved far beyond the P-47 technologically, but the principles it embodied, ruggedness, reliability, operational sustainability, overwhelming firepower, and the industrial capacity to build them in numbers that matter remain as relevant today as they were over the skies of Germany in 1944. The flying milk bottle that German pilots once mocked became the symbol of American air power, and its legacy continues every time an A-10 Warthog supports troops in combat, every time military planners calculate force-to-force ratios, every time strategists consider the industrial dimensions of modern warfare. The Luftwaffe's aces refused to engage P-47 seconds once they understood what those aircraft represented. They weren't refusing to fight. They were acknowledging reality that behind every P-47 they saw were thousands more, and behind those thousands were factories that never stopped, workers who never quit, and a nation whose industrial might could not be matched or defeated through conventional means. That acknowledgement marked the end of German air superiority and the beginning of a new era where industrial capacity would be as decisive as tactical brilliance, where quantity and quality combined would prove unstoppable, and where the ability to sustain operations would matter more than the ability to win individual battles. The P-47 Thunderbolt flew into history as proof that in total war, the side that can keep fighting longest, that can replace every loss, that can sustain operations indefinitely against any opposition, will ultimately prevail. It's a lesson written in 15,686 examples, flown by thousands of pilots, maintained by tens of thousands of ground crew, and built by hundreds of thousands of workers. And it remains true today.